back. So for this video, we are going to be looking at the inferior portion of the axial skeleton. So not really the skull, but mainly thoracic rib. I think it's right here, like a hip girdle here or shoulder girdle here. It's where it intersects with the appendicular skeleton. And when we talk about appendicular, we're talking about the limbs, like these hangy things that come off. And if you look at them, and this will be helpful for memorizing them later, is they're both kind of similar in the way that they are patterned. Like the same genes that code for your arms are going to code for your legs, and then just like vary the structure slightly. Okay, so there's still going to be the same amount of like finger bones and toe bones, and there's going to be the same amount of long bones. Like it usually follows this pattern of, put up here, of one long one is going to be the one that's most proximal to the attachment part, or the girdle right up here, where the, in this case, the scapula is that we're looking at. And then there's going to be two bones right here. You can see it on the leg as well. There's two bones. I'm going to come in and we'll talk about who those are in a little bit. And then there's many bones, okay? So that's what the basic patterning starts at. Let's go for some of the key elements. So the first one that's considered part of the axial, or it's on the axis of the body skeleton, is right up here, this cranium. And here on the live model, it looks like the cranium top is a little bit off, and so the skull altogether. Okay, and then we come down here, and the first thing we're going to kind of look at, and they're numbered on this skeleton that I'm using in the real life lecture, is going to be the vertebra. Okay, the vertebra are these small repeated bones with a hole in the center and a spike out the back. And what that spike does is help muscles and ligaments attach for motion, movement, stability. We'll look at those in greater detail because they're going to be broken off into different types of vertebrae. Coming off of the middle section, like one of the middle sections of the vertebrae, is the rib cage right here. You're going to hear the word costal. Costal means like a rib, okay? And if you look on the skeleton, you'll see there's like two different colors of rib for the most part. On the video, there's a blue one. On the live one, we have here kind of like this clear pink. That represents a cartilage. And then in the video, it's all yellow, and then here it's just this white standard bone. So that's actual bone, like osseous tissue proper, right? It's going to have osteons and all that good stuff. Inside the middle part of all of these like thorax, we're going to see here along the vertebrae, you'll notice there's also that little, in the video, it's blue, and on here, it's kind of also that like mushy gelatin semi-opaque color. What that is fibrocartilage. It's a padding that separates each one of these individual vertebrae. There's a lot of reasons it's there, but the main one is because it kind of protects it from the surrounding vertebrae. It absorbs things like pressure, in our case as humans, like vertical pressure, since we're up and down. Like in a long enough timeline, for example, all humans will eventually have back problems because we're putting all of our weight on this like relatively curved spine. You can't see it on the video, but on here you can see how there's like an S shape to it, right? So it's a little bit, we've got some bounce in there. And then the last part of the axial skeleton, which is kind of this little strange piece, which is so cool, it's sacrum and coccyx. So sacrum is really, and I don't know if you guys could see it here on this live skeleton, but it's fused vertebrae. So like when it's being generated in the body, it's coming off of this same patterning genetically, but then it eventually fuses into this bowl-shaped structure, which is where the pelvic girdle is going to attach right here. Another part that's really interesting, let me kind of zoom in here, is everybody here has a tail, right? And we have a tail, it's so tiny, it's right here at the very bottom part, right, of the sacrum, and it's known as the coccyx. And the coccyx, maybe like some people it's like about 3, some people it's around, most people it's around 5. Tiny little like formerly vertebrae, now just little stones, okay? So that's the coccyx. And we still channel nerves through them or along the outsides, and there's still some connective tissue that like binds in here and helps stabilize the structure. So like, you know, you got your tails, right? They're not quite a monkey tail, but, and I can't see if anyone's happy because you can't back one. But yeah, so this is the basic rest of the components of the axial skeleton, right? Okay, let me make sure I have talked about everything I kind of wanted to talk about here because there's a few other things. I want to make sure that the video you see later matches up with, what we go over on here. Um, right. So last week we went over some components of the skull, and if you remember, there were so many bones. There were bones inside the skull, seemingly, and there were bones on the outside of the skull, and it was like, really, there's this much going on? Yeah, for the most part. What you want to think of it as is like this is the cranium, is the bowl-shaped structure here on the very top. Like, and in that we have like some of the other bones that we talked about. We talked about like parietal, part of the frontal, and all of that good stuff, right? Occipital. So, and then over here we call these just the facial bones. These are the bones of the face, of which there are so many. Maxilla, zygomatics, lacrimals, like all of that good stuff. Sometimes people include mandible in the facial bones. I tend to do that. Other people say that is quite sacrilege, but there you have it. Other little bones that we really won't get into until the end of the semester, but are super important, is last week we talked about these bones, like the hyoid and the ossicles and the mandible, all being like the similar structure. So they all derive from gills, right? So, and you get gills, you still have gills during embryonic development. And as much as I wish we still had them, because then I would be super diving in the ocean all the time. And you kind of would, you're thinking about it now, you're like, oh, wow, we gave that up, huh? There's complexity there, but the ones that are part of that, again, are the mandible, the hyoid bone, which looks like a tiny jaw. It's a tiny jaw, it's in the throat. Basically, it sits around like the larynx and it helps us speak and anchor those components. And then the last group that I'm sorry, I said this earlier, but now I'm finally getting to them, is remember we talked about the concept of the meatus? And we have a foramen, which is a hole, like foramen magnum here at the very bottom of the skull, right? It's magnum, so it's big. It's a foramen, so it's a doorway. And then we talked about the idea of a meatus, which is a hallway, right? So if a foramen is just a doorway to go through, like a meatus is a hallway, okay? And so for the external and internal, for the auditory meatus, it's the ear hole. This is where we're going to see those last little gill bones, the last little related to the jaw and hyoid bones. We call those the inner auditory ossicles. Such a great name. Inner auditory ossicles. Tiny little, well, you can really just call them auditory ossicles because we don't have any external ones. But these are the stapes, the incus, and the malleus, and we'll look at those again at the end of the semester. So don't stress out too much because they have some very intricate shapes and functions. Just know they exist, and that is like their hallway, the meatus. Let's see here, what's on my checklist? Yes, we do want to talk about the sternum. The sternum and the manubrium, let's see, are here. So the manubrium and sternum like kind of are this point between the middle part of the rib cage and the upper portion. And it's like going to be right about where your heart is. Right about is going to be the terminal point. Up here is like like where your esophagus is. So this one at the very top, which is eventually going to fuse, this like it's almost like a tie, like I don't know, like a classic. I got Dad a tie for Father's Day tie looking shape, and it's like right there. This part that's like the knot of the tie up at the top, that's manubrium. Okay. This longer part is sternum, and when they fuse together, they are still technically the sternum. This is just going to become the manubrium of the sternum, if that kind of makes sense. All right, so let's talk about thoracic cage. I'm gonna give me just a minute to like move through some of these. Oh, there's a great slide about the hyoid bone, and you can see how it almost like it really does look like a little jaw down here. Almost looks like it has a couple of teeth, but they're not really teeth. It has horns, so I would know about that. Those are processes. Remember, like a process is any part of a bone that sticks out, like an arm jutting out is a process, okay? So there's that. Vertebral column, great. Okay, so now here we are. Let's go over let's think of the vertebral column as like a couple of zip codes, okay? Because like when you're taking our tests, for example, you'll see like, you'll know this thing is a vertebrae. And that's good. And that's like, if you know that much, that's a good place to start. We'd like you to know where it goes, into which grouping, and might attach to what kinds of things, objects in the skeleton. It's got our bones and ligaments. And so we talked about some of the basic shapes, which I would love to have a little one. I think I have to take out the big bone boxes, so I'm going to just grab my model in the real life class. Boop. You can here. I'm going to pass this down in my real life. Could you like make a little circle of it? It's the lower lumbar and the coccyx and the sacrum. There's a hole in the middle of these ones. Here we go. Right, there's like a little hole in the middle. There's a body, which is that flat part that we're looking at that they all kind of connect to, rest to on that fibrocartilage. And then we have these other things, these processes. Remember, a process is just a part of a bone that sticks out, and then they get special names sometimes, right? Like a styloid process looks like a pin, for example, or a condylar process, like an epicondyle, looks like a little fist, right? So those are some of their differences. So they have a few of those. Those are going to help you decide what part of the vertebra it goes into. Thanks. Okay. So there's those. Transverse processes are going to be transverse on either side, right? Like the big spinous process is always going to be the one that's like right here in the most posterior position. It's the most dramatic feature, so it's the easiest one. And whether it's like a flat panel or a really like fine needle-like spine is going to help you figure out if it goes in your neck or in your back, for example. Foramen. We talked about the idea of the foramen, and I don't know if you can really see it on this one, but in the in-person class, we have this little section of a spinal cord, and going through a foramen, it's a hole. Now, there's also going to be in some of these transverse foramen ones on the side, and that'll help you locate it at what portion of the vertebral column it's supposed to normally go, right? So that's like going to be a clue. Other things, if you notice they're all sitting one on top of the other, we'll look at the idea of the articular facet. So like the articular facet or a facet is just where they kind of perch on each other. And I'll pass this around, but you can see right here where they kind of start touching each other on the sides of the foramen. It's a light touch, but it looks like a dinner plate. So when you think of a facet, think of it, it almost looks like a dinner plate with like a little curvature, and something else is going to sit there, right? Like your mashed potatoes or like your salad. Okay. You can tell what I like to have for dinner. That's what I put on the plate. I guess if we're doing that, or the cake. That's where it goes. All right. Let's go back to talk about who is where. This is a little trickier, and I would in the video it doesn't have them colorized, but in a lot of study materials it'll have the different like zip codes or regions of the vertebral column like colorized, so it'll be a lot easier to just kind of start memorizing. The cervical vertebrae are up here, okay? There's 7 cervical vertebrae. Cervical doesn't mean cervix. In this case, it means neck. That is something I always get people on the write-ins on. So please, it means neck, okay? It includes 2 really special ones, but they're labeled here on the in-class skeleton, as you can see, like 1 through 7. They tend to have a process that sticks like right straight out, right? Like they just want to go here. Like they are going directionally like that way, okay? They are going straight up posterior. That's one of the things that's really easy. And then the other thing is we're going to talk about axis and atlas. And these are the only 2 you need to know by name. They live in the neck. And they live under the head. Okay? So those are the only ones that have like really special names to worry about. The next grouping is the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae, there's 12, right? They're like right here under They stop right under the last rib. It's like, here's the last rib at 11, and then 12 is like just like one past. Okay? Let's talk about the thoracic vertebrae, because what it means is thoracic means the thorax, like a bug, right? So if you had like an ant, like a little bug, and it has these like body parts, right? It has a thorax in the middle, and that's where its organs are. It's viscera, and right, and that's very similar to what's happening here. We actually have that cage, or a rib cage, that's protecting a lot of our vital viscera. It's not all of it, but it's a lot of the important stuff, right? So that's one of the things to think about. The change in morphology that you can see, at least on this back part, like when you're trying to figure out, oh, is this one a cervical vertebrae or a thoracic vertebrae, is a lot of people like to look at the position of the posterior process, right? The spinous process will usually point down. It will point inferior, right? So it has like a slant on it that goes boop. So that's a helpful telltale. There's some other things that'll help us with, like when we look at facets and foramina and all that good stuff. But for the most part, like that's the one thing that kind of helps you pick it out on the skeleton. Like, I mean, really, look at this. There's, these two right up here. Like, I feel like right where it makes the cervical transition is really hard, but I'm more likely to give you one like kind of out of the middle, right? AMP1. I want you to know what's going on. I don't want to grill you yet. Let's get an idea of the basics. Okay, so the next set of vertebrae is only 5. But have you ever heard of somebody say, oh, my lumbars, I got to get a lumbar pillow, my lower back, L lumbar. Yeah, so that's them. And so if you look at these, so when you are given an image or one of these like actual vertebrae, and I say like, well, what type of vertebra is this? You're going to look at the spinous process again and see that it has this really broad spinous process. Like it's actually on this one that we're passing, this little portion of the skeleton we've been passing around. Look how broad they are compared to some of these. These just point straight out, and then this is like a fan. They fan out a little bit. So that is one of the things about the lumbar, is they have like this kind of thick fan instead of this like pointy process. Okay? There's 5 of them. They receive the most compression in most individuals because of standing upright and vertical on, so the fibrocartilage tends to go, and this is a site of a lot of arthritis and back pain. Sorry, it's just a human thing. If you live long enough, you get to live a long time, but like the lumbars are gonna get really roughed up. Okay, so that's part of it. There's only 5 of those before you get to like what I think are the 2 easiest parts to memorize of the entire axial vertebral skeleton. All right, so we're right back down here at sacrum. Yay, sacrum. Oops, sacrum is, like we said, it's technically fused bones. The thing is it doesn't really have like proper processes, but it does have foramina right here. And these foramina are where nerves come through. Okay, so that's like, this is one of the things that's important about them. They're a distribution point for a part of the nervous system, which we will go over soon, like at the end of the semester. But it looks like a little tail. It's like all of a sudden, all these nerves divide right off of the spinal column, okay? And then there's this last tiny bit again, which is the coccyx, which is only about like, usually between like 4 and like 5 on a good day. Little tiny vertebra. It's like, some people would say it might be a little bit of an evolutionary hangover. It still maintains some function. We still see it, right? And so this is what you need to know for the vertebral column. Okay, I want to talk about the first 2 cervical vertebrae, the ones that you have to know by name, okay? So they are up here at the skull, and they're axis and atlas. And let me like see if I have a good one. Okay, here we go. Okay, so they're right under the skull. Axis and atlas are named this because of Greco-Roman mythology, right? So in the mythology, there was someone whose name was like Atlas, right? And Atlas was this person who was supposed to be, magical, and they held the planet Earth on like up. and that was their job. Okay, so the idea is that the skull is very spherical, and so that it's being held up by atlas, right? And so when you open up those maps of the planet and they call them an atlas, it's like, kind of partially named for that, if that makes sense. So this is the first one you need to know. It's going to have some special shapes, which we'll talk about. And then the second one right here is axis. So, whereas atlas like kind of lets us move directionally like this, axis lets us move in more directions in the opposite way, right? Like you can do more left and right type stuff. It moves us along on this axis, right? So we're able to use both of these bones together to get that full range of motion. So that's why these two are very important, okay? Like you can't really do that on some of these other vertebrae. Could you imagine if you had like, they just kind of twist in that way. So we'll look at those. That's, yeah, let me see if I can get a really good picture, and then I think I can grab some out of the bone box. I may have to do that. Give me a really good picture of atlas and axis. No, it doesn't want to do it. We're just going to have to look. Okay. Right.